Hi, hello, good morning. Let me join Valentine in warmly welcoming you to ILHAM and today's symposium, which we are organizing in collaboration with our colleagues from the National Gallery of Singapore. For this morning's session, entitled Play of Light, we are looking at Latiff Mohidin's other great contribution to the Malaysian art world, his poetry. And we're very fortunate to have with us today a noted writer and literary translator. Her works have been published widely, and her translation works include German literary texts by Brecht and Kafka, among others. She has recently co-edited Latiff Mohidin's travel diaries, which I understand will be published next year. Please welcome Pauline Fan.
Thank you, Rahel.
Okay, Pauline, we know that Latiff began painting at a very young age. He was considered this prodigy who was winning competitions at the age of 11, but he only really started writing poetry much later, when he went to Berlin and started studying at the National Art Academy. Why do you think this happened much later?
Yeah, I think Pak Latiff's time in Berlin was a really formative one for him. And I think not just for the visual arts, I think there's something happened, like a process of really setting his creative forces free in a way, and the creative energies. Berlin, still till today, is an incredibly dynamic place. It is a place where you do feel the various, I think, the pulse of a lot of European history gathering in this space. Of course, because of the history of Berlin itself and the history of the 20th century, it has a very long history, also beyond the 20th century, of course, of visual art as well as literary tradition. And you do find all these things kind of presently, or you are able to at least access those worlds of the various traditions of both literary and also visual arts in Berlin. And I think this was also the case, of course, in Latiff's educational experience at the Fine Arts Academy in Berlin. At the same time, you must remember that this was the time he learned the German language. And I think when you learn the German language, for him, it was like a process of, to use a phrase by Elias Canetti, setting the tongue free. The tongue is kind of set free, and with that, with his tongue being set free, I think also creative forces are also set free in that way. Of course, he started reading quite a lot of poetry, not only of German poets at that time, but also of the French symbolists. And I think there are particular poets who were very influential to him. I can name 4. I'll talk about them a little bit. I think really the 2 that Pak Latiff has mentioned in conversation, one of the reasons me and Pak Latiff have a nice communication and friendship is really because of our connection with German poetry. And the 2 poets who he has really feels close to his heart, and I think also you can find elements of those influences very clearly in his poetry are Rainer Maria Rilke and also Georg Trakl. These are the 2 that, I mean, I first spoke to him about Trakl, and it was like a connection, you know, this, one of my favorite poets as well. But Rainer Maria Rilke, of course, he is a German language poet. He was one of the, not really considered a so-called modernist, but kind of bridging the traditions of the more traditional poetic practice of German poetry, and also into the modern period. And so he's kind of seen as this linking passageway, which connects the kind of ancient mystical poets, like people like Hölderlin, into the more modernist poets like Georg Trakl. Yeah, and perhaps we can. Yeah, there is one slide. I have the clicker. Sorry. Yeah. The slide. Right. Oh, no, go. 99. Sorry. This one. Yes. Okay, yes. So very briefly, for me, these are the 4 poets, the 4 European poets that are actually very influential in Pak Latiff's poetic practice. Charles Baudelaire, of course, was seen to be the father of modernism, modern poetry and modern literature in France. And Arthur Rimbaud, of course, a little bit later, was one of those very powerful forces of poetic, kind of really freed up the French language in a way. And I think the influence of these poets, or at least the sensibility, is not only evident in Pat Latiff's poetry, but also in his own approach to art in general. Georg Trakl, Georg Trakl also, and also I think with Charles Baudelaire and Georg Trakl, there is a sense also of looking at the kind of underside of society and also of nature. And I think Georg Trakl was very important in this sense because, I mean, even if you see in the Pago Pago works, that you do find that it is not only a kind of organic growth and organic proliferation of forms, but there is also a sense of the decay. And this was a very important aspect of Georg Trakl's work, the decay, always, the decomposition of nature, and in mirroring that, the decomposition of the human condition and the human soul. This was a very important influence from Georg Trakl. For Rainer Maria Rilke, I've always felt that there were certain poems from Latiff Mohidin that I felt had a kind of Rilkean sense. And of course, Rilke, not only was he one of the great poets of the German tradition, he also had a very, very strong link with visual arts. He was the personal secretary for a while of Auguste Rodin, the great sculptor. And of course, Rodin himself was one of those who shaped his own vision of poetry. And so there's the way they shaped, there was a time when Rilke started off being very kind of, this kind of mystical without being religious, and looking for, talked a lot about solitude, solitariness, and the place of man in this existential landscape. But Rodin was the one who taught him to see objects and to actually talk about the physicality, and it really kind of changed his own poetry and his practice. There is one poem I want to read by Latiff Mohidin that, for me at least, kind of captures the Rilkean voice as well. Whether it was intentional or not, I think it's there. So I'm not very good at this, but yeah, here we go. Okay, I will just read it in case you can't see it in the slide. It's called Tenang Telah Membawa Resah. Buat Uda. Tenang telah membawa resah, resah telah membawa kau kemari. Kau telah memilih untuk tidak tinggal diam. Setiap yang kau pegang terasa lama, setiap yang kau jauhi terasa dekat. Waktu pintu tertutup, kau ingin keluar. Waktu ruang terbuka, kau ingin duduk. Kau duduk untuk berdiri. Bungkusan yang kau buka, kau ikat kembali. Yang kau pinta, kau tolak. Yang kau jerat, kau lepaskan. Setelah patuh, kau engkar. Setelah menang, kau mengalah. Tenang telah membawa resah. Resah telah membawa kau kemari. Tapi kamarmu bukan di sini. Dan kau merantau lagi. I have also the English version. I will just quickly read the English translation. Is it also in the slide?
Yeah.
Yes. 9. Sorry. There we go, yes. So the English translation by Edin Koo is the calm has brought the storm. The calm has brought the storm. The storm has brought you here. You have chosen to not live still. All that you hold feels old. All you've forsaken feels near. When doors are shut, you want to leave. When space is opened, you want to sit. You sit to stand. The parcel you opened, you bind again. All you request, you refuse. All you snare, you set free. Having conformed, you renounce. Having won, you surrender. The calm has brought the storm. The storm has brought you here. But your room is not here, and you wander once again. Now, this sense of wandering, and this sense also of the room, is very evident in some of Rilke's poems. And Rilke, there is one in particular, I won't recite the whole thing, but there is it's called Eingang, entrance. And it begins with that very image of, it's wer du auch seist, geht hinaus aus deiner Stube. Come out from your room, whoever you are, come outside of your room, darin du alles weißt, where you know everything. And where du auch seist. And it really tells you to emerge from your room, go into the wilderness and search, and it's this kind of search of the solitary individual, which I think is very evident in Pak Latiff's work. There's also the sense of the wanderer, which is, of course, so evident in his travels and in his art, is also something that goes back, of course, to the Minangkabau tradition. This sense of merantau. This is something that the Minangkabaus, of course, as a coming of age, traditionally, for Minangkabau males, the men, it's that coming of age kind of rite of passage, that they have to go and merantau. And this is something also I think he carries with him. So, of course, the influences for Latiff's poetry and poetic practice, as well as his art, I think come from all those directions. So it's not just that he went to Berlin and was suddenly transformed into, of course, he carried all these other influences with him as well.
But how different was it from the poetry that was being produced earlier? There's, I think Bahar Zain, in an essay published in 1973, he wrote, Latiff's poetry brought in a new mode of poetic expression in Malaysia. So just compared to the poetry that was being produced in the 50s, for example.
Yeah. I think it was very different. Of course, it was a continuum, but the main predominant, if you can point to a literary movement of the 1950s in Malaysia, was the Asas 50, which is the Angkatan Sastrawan 50, which was the predominant figure in that was Usman Awang, of course. Of course, who was a very, very dear, beloved friend and mentor to Pak Latiff, but whose style was really quite different. Usman Awang, of course, was very lyrical and really had a beautiful language, use of the Malay language. But many of the concerns of the writers of Asas 50 were very much shaped by social concerns. And in fact, there was this, this art for society rather than art for art's sake. Yeah? So this was the kind of schism that they were debating. Of course, this came out naturally also because this was the time of nationalism, and this was the 50s into Merdeka. This was a main concern of many of the Malay writers at that time. And Usman Awang talked a lot, and many of them spoke also in quite a narrative fashion. This is something that Latiff doesn't really do. He doesn't really have this narrative, telling a story in his poetry, which is something which many of of course, if you go back to traditional Malay poetry, a lot of that is like the syair, and much of it is narrative, not all of it, but some of it is narrative. The hikayat, and also Pantun is a bit different, and I think Pantun is also has influenced Latiff a lot, because the Pantun form has that kind of imagistic sense, even though it's a traditional form, but it has, this, because it's made out of of course, most of us should know what a pantun is. It's this 4-line made out of 2 couplets each, and the first 2 couplets, called the Pembayang Maksud, can be quite abstract and sometimes even quite surreal. And in that way, it can be, I think, it can be adopted very much into the modernist practice, because it has this. It doesn't necessarily relate to the second half. It's very often imagery and metaphor. And a lot of it is sound as well. This is an important thing as well, the sound of the poetry, not just what it is saying. And that's something I think Latiff pays attention to.
What about the language? Did Latiff use more kind of everyday language, or,
I don't think it was so much everyday, not as maybe flowery as some of the older poems, but also little bit more towards abstraction, like his painting as well. Even in his poetry, I think there were times where he kind of tries to abstract. I put together, just to juxtapose, an example of an Usman Awang poem and a Latiff Mohidin poem, but they're both talking about love. The famous Usman Awang poem Kekasih is very beautifully written. And it is modern. I mean, all these things are very much, he was modernist as well in a different sense. You know, it's not that one was more modern than the other, it's just more, they have different kind of impulses in the way they express that modernism. But Latiff Mohidin, I do think, is also playing more with form. And perhaps that also, you can even visually, if you see it on the page, there are certain poems like this, the one that I will show you soon, you can also see that physically, he is doing something with the form. The way he arranges it on the page is also important, and not just what he's saying, and not just also how it sounds. Yeah. I keep forgetting I have this. Okay, so Usman Awang's poem, which is a really beautiful poem. Unfortunately, I don't have the English translation, but just to let you hear it, Kekasih. Akan ku pintal buih-buih menjadi tali mengikatmu. Akan ku anyam gelombang-gelombang menjadi hamparan ranjang tidurmu. Akan ku tenun awan gemawan menjadi selendang menudungi rambutmu. Akan ku jahit bayu gunung menjadi baju pakaian malammu. Akan ku petik bintang timur menjadi kerongsang menyinari dadamu. Akan ku jolok bulan gerhana menjadi lampu menyuluhi rindu. Akan ku rebahkan matahari menjadi laut malammu, menghirup saka madumu. Kekasih, hitunglah mimpi yang membunuh realiti dengan syurga ilusi. This was a 1971 poem by Usman Awang. Absolutely beautiful, but just to show you that I mean, it's still, if you look at the form, it still does have 3 lines each, and each kind of starting with this akan ku. And the way that Latiff approaches a similar subject. And Latiff, I think, the imagery itself is actually more erotic. It is also talking about the beloved, but it is more erotic, I think, and a bit sensual, overtly so. And the imagery that he uses, the metaphors that he uses, really evokes also the erotic act, I think, much more directly than Usman. So, sajak-sajak tengah malam. Malam ini, bulan telah membuka tirai emasnya, ombak telah membuka bibir merahnya. Mereka bertemu di sini, di lereng pinggangmu, untuk menyaksikan tarian asyikmu, tarian mautku. Kulihat bagaimana ku sapu alismu dengan manisan. Kulihat bagaimana semut mabuk di lengkung alismu beriringan. Sorry. It seems to be going on. Oops. Okay. Can you? Sorry. Dari kerongkongmu yang sepi ku dengar serigala meraung, kuda meringkit, singa menderam tiada hentinya, dan halkumku turun naik semakin keras menyahut pekikan kerongkongmu. Pahamu kacip yang lembut. 7 lautan gelombang di pusar perutmu, berpusing. Denyutan purba memanggil namaku, ku turuni bukit, ku tinggalkan padang luas, aku merangkak kembali ke lubuk kelammu. This to me is a really erotic poem. I mean, the imagery itself is really very evocative, yeah? Much more directly, but also very, the metaphors I think are really genius for Latiff. We do have a translation. I'm sorry the slides have kind of gone all over the place. But if you can see, you can see actually that the form itself, the way he's arranged the poem itself is visually very different. It's not this kind of structured. And he's put them into 2 sections. Also, one of them is like 3, almost just 5 words. The poems of the deep night. This night, The moon unfurls its golden curtain. The wave opens its red lips. They come together here at the slant of your waist to witness your dance of ardor, my dance of death. You look at how I graze your eyebrows with sweetness. I look at how the ants intoxicate the arc of your eyebrows in procession. From your silent throat you hear the wolves howl, the horses whine, the lions roar incessantly. And my Adam's apple rises and falls, hardens, answers the scream of your throat. Your thighs, soft scissors. 7 seas, a single wave on the navel of your belly, undulating an ancient pulse, calls my name. I descend from the hill. I leave the open field. I crawl back into the depths of your darkness. It was translated by Edin Ku. This to me is a good example of how different Latiff was and what he actually brought to Malay poetry of that time.
I mean, you mentioned Berlin, and I wanted to ask you more about that, because I think Latiff writes a lot about that experience of being in Berlin and how exciting it was, and you get this impression he was this like sponge that was just soaking up everything, and also from everything from like Brazilian music, and he talks specifically about Japanese music and poetry and kabuki dance. I mean, and I think all those influences, of course, made his poetry very sort of multifaceted. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, I think Berlin was really a formative time for him, for that he did absorb a lot of these, and encountered at first also a lot of these exciting new forms. He went to see things like Günter Grass exhibition, and this was an exciting time in Berlin. This is the 1960s. I think Latiff arrived actually 1 year before the Berlin Wall started to be constructed, which is a really fascinating time. I mean, Berlin was really fresh coming out of this, not that far from World War II. It was still, the wounds of World War II were still very much there. And also then this thrust into the Western, of course, the division of East Berlin and West Berlin. This was a real thing. Also the division of Europe, and then the influences of both sides, both equally, the cultural influences from both the Eastern Bloc and the West were, I think, both equally powerful. I mean, and I think Latiff was in the middle of all that, including he was there actually when Kennedy came to Berlin. Those historic moments. In fact, that's one of the things he writes about in his travel diaries, and he writes about it in the really beautiful kind of anecdotal way that I think he had a toothache while he was suffering from a toothache on the day when Kennedy arrived, and almost accidentally kind of happened upon this huge crowd, but was there and listened to that, Ich bin ein Berliner speech, that famous Kennedy speech in Berlin. So he experienced all these historic moments. He saw Willy Brandt driving by, and these were incredible times. And yes, of course, it was not just an exposure to German art, but also to things like Japanese art, Brazilian music, and many of his peers, the students in the academy itself, they also influenced him to look at things that they were doing. Those travel diaries are actually very interesting. A very beautiful and evocative time of his time. He spent a lot of time in Paris as well, and of course also traveled around Europe to places like Crete. It's very, very interesting times.
Like Japanese haikus, right?
Yeah.
That's one of the things he was.
Japanese haiku is, I think, another influence that has been very influential in Latiff's work. He did some versions even, he did some translations, not from the Japanese, but from the English. But the haiku, the conciseness of the haiku form, and also, of course, the metaphors from nature, the images from nature. And of course, it's interesting to note that also things like the Japanese haiku were very influential also in what we call modernist poetry, particularly things like imagist poetry. If you think about the imagists the Imagist movement of the, well, so-called movement of the people like Ezra Pound, of course, even TSL, they were all taken up by things like this, the Imagist nature of Eastern poetry. So Eastern poetry, older Eastern poetry, like the haiku and like classical Chinese poetry, was very influential in modernist European work and English. Definitely in the English language, people like Ezra Pound really took those things and kind of transformed them. Even he did versions, he did translations of classical Chinese, and he did his own haikus. This was very influential in European poetry as well, and then which then also became then influential again in our part of the world.
I mean, we're sitting here in this gallery with Latiff's, beautiful works all around us. So I think we should talk a little bit about the connections between his painting and poetry. Reza Piedasa called Latiff's paintings a poet's vision of the world. And conversely, I think his poems too are very rich with visual imagery. It almost feels like it's like a still life that then gets sort of set in motion. Can you talk a little bit more about it?
Yeah, his Latiff's painting, particularly of this period, I think, and does relate very much to his poetry, because I think in some ways they were trying to reach at a certain essence of something and go beyond the form. Of course, he's using forms, but he's kind of constructing his own vocabulary with using these forms. And I think he is, particularly through his travels to Southeast Asia, also applying certain things that he maybe picked up in Berlin. Of course, again, like the expressionism, I think, was very influential in Latiff's visual art. Of course, the strong lines, the colors, and the approach to forms. But of course, he transforms that into very much his own vocabulary. And I think he was using those techniques to then look at something like the structures of Southeast Asia. Of course, he did, after his travels in Europe, he spent a lot of time traveling in the Nusantara region and also in the Mekong region. Of course, that's where he gets, like the Sungai Mekong was the first book of poems, which was kind of seen as to be something very new and radical in Malay poetry. But they are very much related. And I think the fact that he also wrote, he kept writing even the travel diaries while he was doing his paintings and also doing his sketches. They always go together. So he is always finding and discovering even. It's not that he's putting names to things. I think he's discovering. It's almost like, archaeology, that he's going and also discovering for himself and finding some kind of vocabulary, both in visual vocabulary as well as verbal vocabulary.
And I suppose, we could discuss the relationship with nature, right? That's so prevalent in both his art and poetry, and it's a very complex kind of treatment of nature. It's not simply you're inspired by nature. It's so much more than that.
No, absolutely, and it's very different from, of course, the landscape painting that we know of previous times, or this kind of romanticized or idyllic view of our part of the world, which, very often it's this Orientalist view of our part of the world is always this kind of idyllic, exotic, the seductive kind of realm. And I think he was trying to deconstruct that as well, that it's, what is that essence of that? There is an energy, of course, like you say, there's a sense of motion, I think, in all of his works, but it does seem to also challenge the set ideas, visual images that many people do have of this part of the world.
And also, I suppose also perhaps also kind of describing, I think, the effects, I think, of nature on yourself, right? I mean, it's almost a kind of mysticism or...
Yes. No, absolutely. It's very personal, and it's very solitary. And this is where I also feel that, as much as there is also that strain of, I mean, if you want to think of a European kind of sensibility, Rilke again, I think, has that, you know, kind of, but also German Romanticism, particularly the kind of Sturm und Drang movement of Germany, which is Storm and Stress movement, which was actually a reaction against the Enlightenment. It was a kind of counter-Enlightenment movement. You know, this Sturm und Drang is known as Storm and Stress, and it was in the 18th century. You know, so there were these writers, and Goethe was part of that. Goethe was actually part of that movement as a young man. When he wrote things like The Sorrows of Young Werther, he was part of this movement to actually challenge the too powerful influence of rationalism and the Enlightenment that was making everything, you know, kind of bringing everything out into the open and really sees man as this driven and governed by his rational senses. And they were saying, actually, no, you know, there's another part to man, the subconscious, and the subconscious, which is also very much related to nature, that is equally powerful, if not more powerful, and it's actually the defining element of man's life. Yeah, I think that is also has some influence in Latiff's approach as well.
Do you want to read?
What did I have to read? Oh, Sungai Mekong. Yes, yes, true. Yeah, Sungai Mekong. Of course, this talking about landscape. Yeah, the way that Latiff does relate to his the landscape of this region, which again I think we've also, this was something new as well for Malay poetry. I think that also this very personal, almost mystical way of relating to nature, which of course, again, I think is Muhammad Haji Saleh, I think, who pointed out that also Latiff, besides the modernist influences, was also very influenced by Minangkabau oral traditions, which of course, if you go back to oral traditions, some of these oral traditions have this very immediate way of communicating and very immediate sense of taking in also nature, of also improvisation. You know, they have some of it is very, you know, things like balas pantun and things like that. So when we think of traditional literature, it's actually not traditional in the sense that it's stuck in time. And the oral traditions are very much evolving all the time. And I think Latiff does also grasp that in his poetry, that he does have this sense of also that you are evolving with the landscape and relating to it in a very immediate way. Yeah, so Sungai Mekong. This was when he was traveling in the Mekong region. Sungai Mekong, ku pilih namamu kerana aku begitu sepi. Kan ku benamkan dadaku ke dasarmu. Kaki kananku ke bulan, kaki kiriku ke matahari. Kan ku hanyutkan hatiku ke kalimu, namaku ke muara, suaraku ke gunung. Sungai Mekong, nafasmu begitu tenang, lengangmu begitu lapang. Di tebingmu ada ibu bersuara sayu mencari suara putranya yang hilang. Waktu ia merebahkan wajahnya ke wajahmu, kau masih bisa senyum senang. Sungai Mekong, akhirilah tari siang riakmu. Kulihat di dasarmu kuntum-kuntum berdarah, batu-batu luka. Malam ini, ribut dari utara akan tiba. Tebingmu akan pecah, airmu akan merah, dan arusmu akan lebih keras dari Niagara. And the translation, I'm not sure whose translation this is, but yes, I will read it. River Mekong. River Mekong, I chose your name because I feel so alone. I'll bury my heart in your murky depths, my right leg in the direction of the moon, my left the sun. I'll leave my heart, be carried by your current, my name to the open sea, my voice to the mountains. River Mekong, your breath is so calm, your winding flow so relaxed on your bank. A mother weeps, calling out to her lost son, and when she merges her face with your smile, you could smile your unperturbed, her face with your face, you could smile your unperturbed smile. River Mekong, let not your shimmering ripples dazzle me. On your silk bed I can see many blooms of blood and stones with open wounds. As night approaches, a storm will come from the north, your banks will collapse, and your current will be stronger than the falls of Niagara. Yeah, very immediate and powerful sense of the landscape, I think.
I mean, he wrote this while he was on his big sort of epic journeys, right? And you've edited his travel diaries, and I think that's such an important part of Latiff. He's gone on these, epic journeys, as you say, part of his Minang tradition. I think when he was 16, he got on a bicycle and, rode around the peninsula, which is quite amazing. 1957.
That was the time of the emergency, and he was quite young, and I think he didn't tell his mother, he didn't tell anyone he had gone off, and he just wandered off. Everyone was looking for him, and there was some really what they called black areas in that time, around where he was living in Negeri Sembilan, and he wandered off into those black areas, very adventurous and dangerous, actually.
Yeah. And then later, after he came back to KL, and then did this huge epic trip around Southeast Asia.
Mm-hmm.
And again,
that was the time again. This is Southeast Asia was in the middle of war. It was, the Vietnam War was happening. This is not easy times, Indonesia was there's a lot of upheaval, and these are not easy times. But at the same time, I think he found a lot of creative power. Also, his journeys into Jakarta and to Bangkok, to Bali, he met, I think this is the time he met Gunawan maybe for the first time, from Mas Gun, during the 60s, in this time.
So how do you think that, I think him as a kind of wanderer, as you mentioned, this idea, this Berantau is such a fantastic, I think, the idea of wandering with purpose and seeking knowledge,
Absolutely, and also the sense that when you merantau, eventually, that it is also to come back, to return with all this experience, and you become how you are transformed by that, and what you then bring back to your community because of those travels and the experience you glean from those travels.
Do you want to read one of the uncle? Just read
Should I read the English? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, sure. Yes. Yeah, so this was, this actually shows a lot of how the relation we were talking about his painting and his poetry. Because I think when he was, as he was doing sketches, and he did many sketches of Angkor, he was also doing verbal sketches, he was writing about it, and he was writing about how, so he was thinking through these things through words as well as through as visually deconstructing. I'll just read a quick. This is one of his sketches, which is actually it's a prose sketch. Yeah? Uncle Sketches, number 8. So it is clear to me now that there are two basic forms of energy. One, the structuring energy behind the blocks of stone, forming them into tears like a lotus bud. 2, the cracking energy of nerve vessels, the pattern of thrusting banyan roots, the weaving together of its veins like a spread out net. One is man's composition, which seems to reach up to touch the sky. The other is God's creation, which longs to creep, to touch base, to penetrate into the earth in search of water. Two forms of energy that meet, embrace, clash, merge, that overlap, wrestle, intertwine, break away, surrendering only to attack again, meeting and trashing in throes. Moments pass, days and months pass, seasons, years pass, centuries pass, but the energy of construction and the energy of destruction seem to go on fighting the tremendous battle here, right in front of my eyes. And all the sketches I've worked at all these years, what can I say, are a mere scratch of or two of the force of movement and vibrant of such events. This was translated by Adiba Amin. I think this wonderfully encapsulates what Latiff was trying to get at in his works, as well as in his poetry. I think this is also very similar. But this kind of this construction and deconstruction, this sense of decay, the sense of time and timelessness, the passing of time, both. I mean, of course, he was very aware of the history because he was traveling through these parts of war, of present-day war at that time. But yet there was this older kind of cyclical sense of this underlying history that has gone on for centuries, in which you are just a tiny, whatever art that you are creating is really just a tiny speck. And of course, I mean, who were the artists or the artisans who created Angkor? We don't even know them by name, So, and Latiff, I think, sees himself also in some ways as a line and kind of adding something to that as well.
I'm aware of the time, so I want to sort of go on to talk about Latiff's role as a kind of literary translator, because I think that is significant. I mean, the contribution in terms of having those texts in Malay and available to, readers here. I mean, there's a nice quote by Italo Calvino where he says, "Without translation, I would be limited to the borders of my own country. The translator is my most important ally. He introduces me to the world." And Latiff has translated some very important texts.
Yeah, very important. One of my favorites is actually his translation of Georg Büchner's Wojciech. He did this little anthology, Puisi Modern German, which was published by Dewan Bahasa, I think in 1987. And it's actually out of print, and I really wish they would reprint it, or at least give the rights to somebody to reprint, because it's such a wonderful translation and such an important work, Georg Büchner, of course, was also one of those greats, kind of before the so-called modernists, but very modern, very in his impulse and his subject, and has also been has been filmed by some of the great filmmakers like Werner Herzog and people like that. So, yeah, that is one of my favorites. But in his language, and I think this also, the practice of translating is always also a recreation and also or deconstruction again of your own language. It's not just you are bringing something into a new work into that language. You're creating that language anew, your own language anew, by bringing in this new work, this new sensibility. There's I always think the Walter Benjamin always talked about the task of the translator as it's not just finding the right words, just say in Malay for the German original. It's actually finding in Malay the Germanness that may or may not exist in the Malay language. And if it doesn't exist, you have to create it, And I think that's why it's so exciting for many poets and writers who are creating new works of literature to also do translation, because it invigorates you. It freshens, it's this constant way of really reaching and grappling and wrestling with the very stuff of literature, and it's also a very intimate experience and it's a wonderful way of really embracing and wrestling with some of your great loves of literature. I mean, how you would never get closer to Georg Büchner than actually wrestling with his words. And this is the way I think why Latiff also did a lot of translation is because I think he has this sense, and it's not just people like, of course, Georg Büchner, he translated Mishima from English, but Mishima, people he felt, I think, an affinity with. So they weren't just random choices that he was, oh, this is an important work of the canon to be translated into Malay. No, I think all of the people he translated were very much artists or figures and writers he felt a strong affinity with. And whether they were haiku poets from the Japanese, or Rabindranath Tagore, Gitanjali, he did a version of Gitanjali, also Omar Khayyam. But these are all very selected, carefully selected figures that he has translated, and each of them, I think, speaks a lot about Latiff himself and his own affinities, his own literary affinities. Of course, his last huge work that he translated was Goethe's Faust, and this is one of the most difficult, of course. I would never dream of translating this work because it's so monumental. It's incredibly difficult to translate. It's beautiful to read, of course, but to translate it into another language, I think, is such a daunting task. And Latiff has done it. I mean, in my estimation, I think he did a really brilliant translation. And the brilliance of that translation is the fact that he accesses the Malay language so well to encapsulate that work, that it feels natural in the Malay language. This is always, it feels like it belongs there. It doesn't feel like it's something, so alien and imposed. I mean, you can feel it. You can feel Mephisto come to life in Malay. This is wonderful. Yeah.
I mean, I think poetry must be the hardest thing in the world to translate. You translate poetry. I mean, how do you balance it? I mean, what is more important? I mean, because there's the meaning of it, obviously, but it's like rhythm and I mean, how do you translate rhythm?
Yeah, it's very difficult sometimes especially when the structure of the two languages are so different. You can't always reproduce it. If you're working from something like Japanese or classical Chinese, obviously the rhythms are going to be very different from something like Malay or English. So you can't always find an equivalent for it, but you must always, I think, find some way of being aware and responding to it. So even if you have to create something else, but again, find a new way of looking at your own language. So even if sometimes you have to make your own language more concise or make your own language more maybe rhythmic than it usually is, and these are ways you invigorate the language. And it's always a challenge, and that is what makes it exciting.
So the translator is almost another sort of creator in a way, right?
You are totally, yeah. You are another creator, which is why a literary translator is not the same as someone who's translating, commercial documents. It's very different. I mean, you have to have that literary sense, and if you don't, it's problematic, particularly for poetry. I think, particularly for poetry, you can't be too academic, you can't be too literal, but at the same time, you need to have the understanding. You have to have, of course, the understanding of of the technical aspects, and even the historical context, and you have to have that. But the essence of it really is instinct. I think it really comes down to, there's no formula to make a good translation. You have to be able to hear. Listening, I think, is one of, if there's anything, it's actually listening. It's not even, you have to be able to listen to the original poem, and also to hear that poem emerge in your own language.
So if you were translating Latiff's poetry, for example, would you consult him? I mean, or would you kind of go, and do it yourself? I mean, how much kind of consulting would you?
Yeah, I've never translated Latiff, but Edin has, of course. Edin has been translating Latiff for some time now. And he actually doesn't consult him while he's in the process. He does it. And then I think later, at a later stage, we'll show him the poetry, and they will kind of discuss it. And I think the main thing is to get the sense of it. I don't think he's going, it's not like to reference and to say, Pak Latiff, what did you mean with this? It's later, you get really the sense of and I think it's the way he also works. Edin's also translating Maskun's poetry, and it's the way he works like that is, you have to get the whole sense of, instinctively, this poem and later. And then if there are any details later, then it will be pointed out and discussed. And then it's just a matter of refining. But the music has to be there already. You know, you can't, because it is a kind of music. It's like a, yeah, you are taking, it's like a variation of the original composition.
I mean, I do want to kind of open it up to the audience. If you have any questions for Pauline, colleagues will be walking around to pass some mics. So please introduce yourself and before you ask your question.
Hello, I'm Wen Choi. Thank you for your presentation. My question is just on this last point. Why are translators so neglected then? It really seems like that as you're talking about the translation process, I'm just so overwhelmed by how impressive it is to translate. And yet, in our literary culture, not only in Malaysia, but I think very widespread, we seem to really be very neglectful of the voice of the translator, as if the translator isn't also speaking. You know, they really get this idea that they're transparent or they're invisible, that they're disposed of, that the text just sort of passes through them.
This is a very good question, Wen Choi. I wish I could answer it. You know, this is one of the things we assign ourselves to as translators, that we're not always. I mean, it's wonderful to actually have opportunities like this to actually talk about the art of translation and have an appreciative audience, but it doesn't happen that often. There are certain trends, I think, in today's literary landscape that is maybe paying a little bit more attention. It's still very small. I mean, certainly it's not in a commercial sense. Literary translation is not seen to be something, it's not like a best-selling, you know, it's not something, I think it's something like 3% of, 3 to 5% of the major literary output in the Western world is supposed to be that. But having said that, places like Germany do really have a very vigorous practice and tradition of translation, you know, and places like that, I think they do recognize the importance of translation, where certainly some of the great scholars, German scholars, who even started translating particularly poems from the Arabic and from the Persian, which was then very influential, and people like Goethe, you know, Goethe himself, you know, he wrote this Westostlicher Divan, which was very much like kind of a tribute to Hafiz, and of course he could only do that because there were scholars of that time who were doing work, very fundamental and foundational translation work into German of those works. So you do have a sense of that, I think, in the German tradition, and in probably elsewhere as well, but maybe to a lesser extent, and certainly in the commercial publishing is very often overlooked. But having said that, there's in small presses these days, which is actually where a lot of the more interesting work in the Western world is being published, a lot of it is in translation. A lot of it is work that is in literary translation. And I think it's getting more, at least a little bit more visible, that the role of the translator is getting a little bit more visible. I wish it was a bit more in our parts of the world too, but maybe it's slowly, hopefully this changes. Yeah.
Any more questions?
I'm Yusuf.
Hi.
Let me speak in Malay, kalau boleh.
Boleh.
Okay. Berkenaan dengan Latiff punya sejarah, kisah dia very informative, tapi sikit sangat disentuh masa zaman dia di sekolah dan sumbangannya, especially di sekolah di Lengging dan KJV Seremban. Setahu saya masa di KJV di Seremban, sumbangan Latiff adalah ilustrasi map dalam buku teks sejarah yang ditulis oleh Jogidan Singh. Dan bawah setiap peta atau map dalam buku teks history book tu, dia bubuh initial dia Alma. mungkin orang tak berapa tahu.
Memang
Dan saya biasa tengok buku tu. Yang satu lagi, masa kami awal di anak alam, pengaruh Latiff jarang diperkatakan kepada anak alam awal. Masa anak alam awal, kebanyakan kami hafal sajak dia. Especially sajak Darahku. Sampai sekarang dekat 50 tahun saya dalam kepala. Dan juga pilihan kami masa time tu, walaupun banyak cakap tentang Sungai Mekong, tapi kami lebih sending, lebih skewed tu Maya. Yang ditulis di Vientiane. Pasal dia lebih pada masalah personal rather than meluas kisah Sungai Mekong. Dan kami hafal sajak Maya dan Pohon Cemara 1965, 1966 di Copenhagen. Thank you.
Terima kasih. Does anybody need translation for that? This gentleman, I was actually saying that because Latiff's childhood also, he had already started drawing, and he was drawing maps in history textbooks. I didn't know that. I actually didn't know that. It says wonderful, and he had put his initials down there. His initials, yeah. But also how influential he was also in the Anak Alam movement, of course. The Anak Alam artists also were memorizing his poems. Yeah, and I think Latiff does have that. And again, the oral tradition is almost like, you imbibe this, and like this gentleman said that Maya, Latiff's poem Maya was actually one of those poems which everyone was memorizing. I mean, this is something, the memorization of poetry and this kind of thing, this is something that the Russian poets used to do. The Russian poets of the Silver Age, Akhmatova and Pasternak, and they were in these little literary circles where they would recite each other's poems. And I think it's wonderful to think that we used to have this kind of practice here. I mean, it doesn't really happen anymore, Now we have all these festivals and it's, we have these readings and poetry slams, but it doesn't really feel like quite as organic. Well, certainly maybe not as bohemian. It's a bit sad, but yeah, this is a special time, I think, this Anak Alam time for poetry as well as art.
Thank you. Thank you, Pauline. It's such a wonderful presentation. And yeah, we met several times. We've never talked about Latiff and his works like this one. And I'm very happy to listen to that. My question is, when you touch upon Latiff's connection with the Rilke, which to me is very, I talked about it last time, it tells you about his connection with the visual art. But would you please elaborate more about Rilke's Dinggedicht? Because it's very much, I try to incorporate in my next talk, but my German is very little and I don't have the time. So please do that. Thank you.
Yeah, so the Muskin would like me to elaborate a bit on the Dinggedicht of Rilke. And this was, like I mentioned, that Rilke was very influenced also by his kind of mentor, Rodin. Yeah, and Rodin was the one who's really went out. Of course, one of the famous story that Rodin told Rilke to go to the garden and look at the animals in this garden and write about it, and Rilke went, and this is in Paris, and he went and he encountered a panther in a cage, and just from spending hours observing and staring into the eyes of this creature, he then produced one of the most famous and one of the most considered to be one of the greatest poems in the German language, which is Der Panther. And this was also, and then later on also he wrote these poems which are known as the kind of Dinggedicht, which was really, it was quite revolutionary for Rilke's poetry, because Rilke, of course, was writing before that a lot of, the Stundenbuch, the Book of Hours that he wrote, a little bit more sort of kind of a mystical wanderer sense, and not really looking at and more looking at those internal processes and and existential questions. But then he transferred some of those concerns then to look at objects, and how do you express that actually in the solidness of objects, but looking under those objects. So, but it's something really this kind of again wrestling or grappling with the material to find something is more essential in that. And this, I think, was also very influential this is maybe, I think, how Latiff also approaches his work, is through the material and through the solidness of something, the form, to get beneath it and to deconstruct it and to get to the essence of it by, sometimes really also destroying that form itself. But through that you can't just do it from outside of this form and object, that you also have to actually grapple with that itself. And that was something actually very new for Rika and for German poetry itself. We didn't actually talk, I wanted, because Mas Gun has now asked a question, I actually think we just have to mention also the influence of Khairil Anwar on Latiff Mohidin, because I think Khairil Anwar, of course, was someone who Latiff Mohidin held very closely to him, and in his own poetic practice as well. Yeah.
Any more questions? I'll ask you, since we were talking about Ana Alam, right? Because Latiff did actually do a couple of, he started the magazine, the literary journal, Dewan Sastra with Usman Awang. And there were other things that they did, like they organized this Hari Puisi, which sounds amazing. This is like all these students came together, and it was in East Malaysia and West Malaysia, and all these different sort of activities. Can you talk a little bit about?
Yeah, and I'm probably not the best person to talk about it. Probably Kanaga can say a lot more about this. But yeah, I think this was really an exciting time. I was not even born yet, so I was not there.
Neither was I.
But of course we've heard a lot about it, and we've heard about this exciting time for Malaysian art. Yeah, I wish I was there during this time. Of course, we've read about it, and I think it was for both literature and, I mean, Dewan Sastra at that time. I think Dewan Bahasa was really a radical institution. They were doing radical things. Usman Awang was at the helm of it, and I think they were publishing wonderful work. They were exploring. They were open. They were trying to look for this kind of, like this question of what is modern Malay literature. I think this was very much a question that they were asking, and I mean, again, just very briefly maybe to talk about, I think I'm more equipped to talk about the literary side of things. So, besides things like the Angkatan, the Asas 50, and of course people like Latiff, then people like Bahazain also were writing. Then there was also these little movements that kind of died out after a while. There's one called the Obscure Poets. There was one obscure movement which was called themselves the Obscure Poets, and they were also doing something quite radical at that time, which was really going further and further into abstraction, and going further and further away from meaning, and more into imagery, into sound, it was almost quite surrealist in nature, maybe even Dadaist in sensibility. But I think these were concerns that were very alive at this time, and that people were putting into practice, and not just thinking about it. They were really practicing. They were writing poems like that, and this is really interesting. There's also like some of the more Dadaist ones, like the Taktun poem, Ghaffar Ibrahim, I think, this just really sound like something like Kurt Schwitter's, this just kind of sound, Taktun. I mean, these are all very interesting and very of the time, of course, but you are really deconstructing the language, the sound of Malay. What is Malay poetry? I think it's really exciting times.
Well, we have one more question.
Sorry, Just to inform, anak alam never organize a poetry reading. Poetry, hari puisi organized by Dewan Bahasa, Gapena, or Ceta Elit. Anak alam organized Hari Alam. The Nature Day, that was 74, and a lot of happenings and street theater. That's for your information.
I think we've come to the end of our session. It's time for lunch soon. So let me just end by thanking our speaker, Pauline Fan, for such an interesting.
Thank you.